The morning light in London carried a muted tone, a mixture of autumn grey and the steady calm that often precedes meetings of high diplomatic weight. Down Whitehall, security cordons guided the movement of delegations and press, with camera crews positioning themselves outside the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Inside, more than 30 allied nations were gathering for what has been described as a renewed push to increase strategic pressure on the Russian Federation. The session was part of the ongoing platform known as the Coalition of the Willing, a grouping of Ukraine's principal military backers that has evolved gradually since the invasion of February 2022. The meeting was hosted under the guidance of British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who sought to signal a shift in emphasis that the war in Ukraine remains an active and unresolved crisis, and that sustaining Ukraine's defence capacity requires both material support and stronger financial measures with long-term durability. As officials took their seats in the meeting hall, the symbolic presence of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky underscored that the war continues to define the political and security landscape of Europe. Zelensky had earlier held an audience with King Charles III at Windsor, a diplomatic gesture reflecting the UK's continuing role in the coalition of support. His arrival in London signalled that Kyiv still places significant importance on maintaining momentum among its allies, particularly as the conflict has shifted into what analysts describe as an endurance phase defined by attrition, supply logistics, and the ability to sustain power generation and basic services through the winter months. Prime Minister Starmer opened the meeting by drawing attention to Russia's continued military operations and missile strikes targeting Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. His remarks emphasized that sanctions targeting the Russian energy sector are designed to limit Moscow's ability to fund the war. In his own words, he stated, "We are choking the Russian war machine." And I am urging others to take these steps too, to go further to reduce their dependencies and incentivize third countries to stop buying these contaminated resources. His phrase, contaminated resources, referred to oil and gas sales that enable Russia to sustain its defence manufacturing capacity. The United Kingdom had already sanctioned all major Russian oil companies. The United States and the European Union followed with measures affecting Rosneft and Lukoil. The discussion moved to the broader question of frozen Russian state assets held in Western jurisdictions. These assets, estimated at roughly $244 billion, represent a potential source of funding for Ukraine's reconstruction. Starmer framed the issue clearly, stating, "The bill for Russia's destruction in Ukraine should be paid by Russia. So we want to move quickly with the work necessary to deliver reparation loans and get the funds to Ukraine." European leaders have debated this issue for months, particularly given that a significant portion of the frozen assets are located in Belgium under the Euroclear system, and any legal move to repurpose them touches upon questions of international financial law and precedent. The previous day in Brussels, the European Commission and European Council leadership signalled openness to exploring financing mechanisms that would channel revenues from frozen assets into Ukrainian support over the next 2 years. The language used was intentionally cautious, reflecting differing views among European states about how to structure such a policy to avoid unintended legal consequences or reciprocal actions affecting European investments held abroad. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, addressed the media after the Brussels session. Her remarks noted that while operational details require careful negotiation, the principle of linking Russian financial assets to Ukrainian recovery is gaining traction. The approach currently under examination involves establishing a loan system backed by the returns generated from frozen Russian sovereign assets. In practical terms, the capital itself would remain immobilized, while the proceeds generated could be transferred to Kyiv. Back in London, Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke to the assembled leaders, reinforcing that diplomatic statements, while symbolic, must convert into tangible material outcomes. He said, "The bottom line is real forms of pressure on Russia, sanctions, our long-range capabilities, political pressure, accountability for war crimes and real action on Russian assets." His intervention emphasized Ukraine's strategic priority, the need for sustained military assistance that enables Ukraine to maintain combat capacity across multiple fronts, while simultaneously ensuring that its energy infrastructure survives the winter. The tension in these discussions reflects the operational realities on the ground. Ukrainian cities have experienced repeated power outages following Russian air and missile strikes. In regions such as Chernihiv, efforts to repair transformers, substations and distribution lines are continuous, Though the scale of damage often exceeds the available repair capacity, local authorities have reported periods when electricity is available for only a few hours per day in some districts, affecting hospitals, heating systems and communications networks. In Kherson, damage from shelling has left residential buildings without windows or functioning utilities, reinforcing the humanitarian dimension of the conflict. Local administrations coordinate evacuation routes, temporary heating shelters, and the distribution of basic supplies, while reconstruction crews assess structural integrity and determine salvageable portions of damaged housing blocks. These scenes feed directly into Kyiv's argument that Russian financial assets should play a role in funding recovery, not as a punitive gesture alone, but as a practical necessity to stabilize daily life in affected areas. At the London meeting, the focus extended beyond sanctions and financing mechanisms. Leaders also discussed air defense systems, particularly as Ukraine has urged allies to accelerate deliveries of interceptors capable of countering ballistic missile threats. The United States, Germany and France have contributed systems over the last year, including Patriot batteries, IRIS-T launchers and mobile counter-drone platforms, though the pace of delivery is often constrained by manufacturing pipelines and the training required to operate and maintain such equipment. Prime Minister Starmer addressed the broader significance of sustained support, stating that winter intensifies the strategic importance of energy infrastructure. Russian attacks during previous winters targeted power stations, district heating plants and fuel storage sites, creating widespread shortages. Preparations for the current winter involve the distribution of portable generators, establishment of mobile heating points, and the reinforcement of key nodes in the electricity grid. However, these measures remain vulnerable to coordinated missile barrages. French President Emmanuel Macron, speaking via video link, echoed the need for unity among allies. He emphasized that maintaining Ukraine's defense capacity is not solely a European responsibility, but an international one, linked to the broader question of upholding international law and deterring future acts of aggression. Macron noted that long-term stability requires not only defending Ukraine's territorial integrity, but also establishing a framework for accountability concerning violations of international humanitarian law. Throughout the meeting, the presence of NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte highlighted that the conflict is increasingly shaping NATO planning and readiness efforts. While Ukraine is not a NATO member, the alliance has expanded coordination mechanisms to ensure that military support is synchronized, supply lines are protected, and contributing states are able to maintain their own defense capacity while providing equipment to Kyiv. Rutte emphasized that alliance policy remains focused on support and deterrence, avoiding direct military confrontation, while reinforcing defensive systems across member states bordering Russia, Belarus, and the Black Sea region. The press conference that followed the London session presented a unified message, though with deliberate caution on the specifics of asset repurposing. Standing alongside Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, Zelensky, Starmer, Rutte and Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof reaffirmed their commitment to ensuring Ukraine enters the winter months in what they described as the strongest possible position. The decision-making process that underpins these commitments remains complex. Sanctions enforcement requires coordination across customs agencies, financial compliance departments, shipping regulators, insurance networks, and energy brokers. The global nature of the oil and gas market means that restricting Russian exports depends not only on Western states, but also on buyer behavior in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Starmer's reference to third countries reflected this dynamic, calling for diplomatic engagement with states that continue to import Russian hydrocarbons at discounted rates. Meanwhile, the question of how frozen Russian assets might be redirected to Ukraine continues to generate legal analysis within European institutions. The matter touches upon principles governing sovereign immunity, property rights under international law, and the risks associated with establishing precedents that could affect the global reserve system. Economists and policy analysts emphasize that decisions taken now will shape the structure of international financial governance in the years ahead. For Ukraine, however, the issue is immediate. Reconstruction needs extend beyond military defense. The country faces challenges in restoring transport networks, bridges, water treatment facilities, and telecommunications systems damaged during the conflict. International aid organizations continue to coordinate relief operations, though the scale of need remains large. The Ukrainian government estimates that the total cost of reconstruction and recovery may exceed several $100 billion. President Zelensky has repeatedly underscored that the continuity of support is as important as the scale of support. In his remarks, he reiterated that diplomacy must produce concrete outcomes. His emphasis on accountability for war crimes aligns with ongoing investigations by international legal bodies, including the International Criminal Court, which has issued warrants and opened formal inquiries into actions taken during the conflict. As winter approaches, the situation inside Ukraine will continue to be shaped by the pace of infrastructure repair, the availability of energy supplies, and the effectiveness of air defense systems in mitigating further damage. The political discussions in London and Brussels reflect the understanding that the outcome of the conflict will be influenced not only by events on the battlefield, but also by the ability of Ukraine and its allies to sustain resources over time. The coalition of the willing meeting concluded with a reaffirmation of strategic prioritization. While the pace of decision-making varies across governments, the shared objective remains consistent: to support Ukraine's defense capacity and ensure that it retains the ability to function as a sovereign state. The final remarks from leaders reflected a collective recognition that the conflict has entered a stage defined by persistence, coordination, and long-term policy alignment. The path forward will require managing economic pressures, balancing domestic considerations, and sustaining political will. For Ukraine, the stakes remain clear and immediate. For its allies, the commitment now extends into the structural and financial dimensions that define prolonged conflict support. The next phase of these discussions will continue at the upcoming European summit, where proposals concerning frozen assets, supply coordination, and winter infrastructure support will be debated further. The outcomes of those negotiations will shape the direction of international support through the winter and into the next year. The situation on the ground, the diplomatic positioning in European capitals, and the decisions made in international institutions will continue to intersect. The conflict remains unresolved. The pressures, calculations, and choices made now will influence not only Ukraine,